Cheers. Hi, everyone. I hope the day has been very informative and exciting so far. It sounded like some great pitches. I've done a lot of these, and I have to say, I don't think I've ever seen people keep to time so tightly. Usually they drift, so I thought that was an amazing group, especially the last one, of course, and everyone, I think, recognized that with your applause. I want to thank Victoria for inviting me and the team for inviting me back and congratulate them on the progress of Startup Canada. So going back a few years, I was on the board of Startup Canada, and I think at the time there were somewhere 12 or 15 startup communities, and I understand from the team that it's now 40 to 50. And I will say that Victoria, that was her goal, was to get to 40 or 50, and so I'm really congratulate her for an amazing, and the team, of course, for an amazing success with Startup Canada. I've been a career founder and CEO in the Canadian market predominantly, although I've done business abroad, and I know that's part of the theme today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about lessons that I've learned abroad. Been a 12-time founder or co-founder CEO, had my fair share of successes and have had my fair share of failures. So on another day where there was more time, I'd be happy to take your questions and talk about those failures. If there's a couple minutes left at the end, I will do that. And I look forward to the tough questions, because the failures are definitely where I learned the most. So I want to start by saying that I absolutely love Canada, and why I wrote that book, How We Can Win, is because I love Canada. And I've become very fearful of, even though I'm an eternal optimist, I've become fearful about Canada's prospects in the global economy. And I think it has to do with its roots, our roots as a British colony. And I trace that back in my book quite a bit, the mindset of a colony where we were, in the first half of the history of this country, serving the British Empire, and in the second half of our history, in the 20th century, we were serving the current world power, the United States. And so I think it's a big part of our future prosperity depends on us shaking free of that colonial mindset. And you do see it happening now with, in the last 10 years, the evolution of the innovation ecosystem in Canada, of which Startup Canada is a key component. But we still have a tremendous way to go. I was very vocal and negatively vocal on our leadership welcoming US big tech and favoring US big tech over our domestic startups. I thought that was an unmitigated disaster for Canada, perpetuating the branch plant economy that we have, again, at our colonial roots. There's no reason for us to have branch plants of major global corporations. We want to have our own global winners. And it's the innovation ecosystem that we have in Canada that's starting to build the momentum so that we will have 10, 20, 30 global winners. And by the way, it's not something that's unheard of. In Finland, in Israel, and these types of countries that are smaller than Canada, much smaller than Canada in several cases, they have global winners. We have some today with Shopify and the likes of some big tech companies that are emerging here. I hope that we continue it and we don't have another playback of a repeat of Nortel or RIM, where we had a leadership position and we lost it. I think it has to do also with our business culture. You know, we fancy ourselves as very rugged and have a spirit of adventure as Canadians, but our business culture is actually timid and quite risk-averse still. Even though we have a very open and pluralistic society, strong democratic institutions, we have a great sense of fairness and decency, we have great education, healthcare infrastructure and systems. We have all of that going for us, and then in business, we are quite timid and risk-averse. And I think that needs to be changed, and also that has to do with the colonial mindset. I think an important thing to remember as Canadians as well, and again, why I'm fearful, is I don't think anyone in this room would be excited about a business that has 75% of its revenue coming from one customer. Would anyone find that to be a good idea? I don't think anyone in here would think that's a good idea. Would anyone think it's a good idea that a company has 75% of its revenue coming from one customer, and the services and products that we sell that customer, they have multiple other sources of at the same or lower cost? Meaning our leverage with our customer is essentially zero. That is exactly how this country is being run today. The customer being of course, the United States, fully a quarter of our GDP. Diversification away from the US is central to Canada's future prosperity. China is our second biggest customer, and the current administration, which I'm also vocally negative on, has successfully blundered that relationship. The relationship with China is currently about 4 or 5% of our exports versus 75% to the United States. That is our single biggest prospect for diversification away from the United States. So I hope that it's a priority for the re-elected administration to remedy the situation with China, because that's really a very, very important trade relationship for us as an export economy. And as a small country, we're always going to be an export economy. So I'll move on to a few lessons that I've learned in business. Not a lot of time today, so I'm going to be quick. Raising capital. The biggest lesson I've learned raising capital, I've raised close to $2 billion privately and publicly for companies that I've either founded or co-founded over the last 23, 24 years now. The biggest lesson is that raising capital is not an event-driven exercise. And everyone in the investment community would want you to believe that it is, and that is the way the investment community is structured. It's 60 to 90 to 120 days of diligence, it's term sheets, let's close a transaction. To successfully raise capital for your business in a sustainable way, I think you have to think much more how a big corporation thinks about raising capital. And that is that they're continuously raising capital. Why? Because they have a corporate finance department that is constantly in the marketplace, strengthening relationships with existing investors and prospecting for new investors. So you as a founder CEO, you, I think, have the obligation to do that. And I've been successful raising capital when I looked at it that way. And I spent fully 10 to 20% of my time, when I look back over the last 25 years, 10 to 20% of my time just raising capital. When I started, I didn't know that what I was doing was a good idea. I got lucky in hindsight. But as I've gotten further and further into my career, I realized that that's so critically important. 20 to 25% of my time throughout my career has been spent building culture, campaigning my ideas for the cultures that I wanted in my organization. That's like a day or plus a week. We're all super busy. We all have tons of priorities. That's really hard to do. But I think that the reason my organizations have won the awards they've won with respect to culture and best management awards and all these types of awards throughout best workplaces, all these awards that we've won throughout our history, I think it's largely due to the fact that we always had cultural alignment. And I always spent a huge amount of my time, 20, 25% of my time, walking through all the organizations that I've ever built, meeting as many people as I could. And then when we got to scale, that was obviously harder when there were thousands of people. It was obviously much harder when then there was, just me. But I think in hindsight, that was a critically important thing. And again, didn't start thinking that was a great idea. I did it because I thought it was just good to get to know the people that were working in the organization. But in hindsight, that allowed me to campaign it did allow me to campaign a culture that ended up being so entrenched that as the organization scaled, what we believed in and what we wanted to achieve was just in our DNA. First sale. This is something that I always talk to tech founders, and I've invested in over 100 early stage technology companies over the last 15 years. I have a team that manages that and invests venture capital, pre-seed, seed, Series A. And we always invest, and we do invest regularly, in pre-seed or pre-revenue companies. And I always find that there's a mindset with founders that say, well, we really want the right MVP. We want the right minimum viable product to be there before we start selling it. And I just think that is a significant mistake. I think you got to get it slimmed down. I think you got to get customer feedback. You got to get out in the marketplace as quickly as possible and talk to customers about what they might want to see. And you have to iterate on that and get something in front of them quickly, get LOIs in front of them quickly and say, look, we really need you as a charter customer. We really like you to use this product in a freemium model or however you want to approach the commercial model is not as important as actually getting out there and engaging customers and prospective customers. And saying, hey, if I come back to you in 3 months and 6 months and 9 months with something that was what we just discussed, what would you potentially pay for that? And all the software businesses we're invested in, the most successful ones are founders that do that. And again, I think that's been a part of our success at Global Live in the businesses that I was operating, was that I was out in the marketplace talking to customers. And in case of wind, for example, I was out in the stores, selling phones to really understand. And it wasn't always great. People say, well, the network doesn't work, this doesn't work, the data's slow, all these things. You have to hear it to really be able to improve your product. And the last thing I'll say before I take a few questions, a big lesson that I've learned is about time and time management. And there's like a ton of books that are written about this, tons of apps to help you manage your time in today's world. There's just so much going on in this area of time management. And there's lots of like best practices I'm sure we're all in this room familiar with. What I think has been the biggest lesson for me in time is trying to look, I've gotten my life to the point where I'm looking at life in hours. Not in days or weeks or months or years, but in hours. And I'm not anal about time. I love spending time with friends, family, and like relaxing and doing all the things that everyone loves to do. But when you look at your life in terms of hours, I think it gives you an appreciation for how terrifyingly brief and finite our existence is. And so when you think about it, we have about 70 useful years from, say, 15 to 85. That's about 25,000 days, which is about 600,000 hours. We have to sleep and eat and relax at least a third of the time, so you have 400,000 hours. So when you think about it, your entire life, to do everything you want to do, is only 400,000 hours. So today, you can measure that. Today, you're spending 4 or 6 hours, whatever you are here today. 8, that's 8 over 400,000. It's measurable. And I think when you start thinking about it that way, I've become just naturally more inclined to make the best use of my time. I'm certainly not the most efficient person in the world. I'm just as lazy as everyone sometimes, and just as inefficient as people as everyone sometimes. But just keeping every day in mind like that has allowed me to be a lot more productive in not just my business life, but in my personal life. So those are 4 kind of big lessons. There's 2 minutes left. If anyone has a question, I'm happy to take it. Hi. Hi. Oh, thank you.
But in your perspective, what are things we should do in order to motivate them to go to global markets?
Yeah, I think it's all about shaking, as I say, the colonial mindset. I mean, we have so much potential here. If you meet Canadians, they're so dynamic, so open and tolerant, so progressive, just amazing, and generally well-liked around the world. And so we have so much opportunity to build global winners that are based in Canada that are exporting globally. And we have organizations like EDC that are, I know, are supporting today's event that are actually not that a lot of Canadians take advantage of, but it's really there. Those are types of government agencies really get taken advantage of in other smaller markets, including the ones I named, Israel and Finland. But I think so your question really is, how do we get people free? How do we get people more motivated to think globally? Well, I think for starters, in Canada, we think about if we start a business in Vancouver or in Winnipeg, we want to expand to Toronto. And I think that's the first thing that we should start thinking seriously about changing, because interprovincial trade barriers are still, and I talk a lot about that in my book too, it's like one of the most crippling things about the Canadian economy is the barriers to interprovincial trade. Far, far easier to trade north-south. So I would say that, as I always say to founders who are in Vancouver or in Winnipeg or in anywhere in the country, well, we want to expand to the bigger Canadian market. I say, well, think about the logical markets in the US. And remember that the US is actually 10 to 12 different countries. We think of the US as one place of 50 states. It's not that. The United States is easily 10 to 12 different countries. So to pick the right export market south of the border that is for the best fit for you to start. So I think it's just really about thinking, wow, the world is, we're 2% of world GDP. Why would you want to stay where there's 2% of the world GDP when you have 25% south of the border, 17% in China? Those are the places that you should think about expanding your business. And I say it in those types of ratios. I say to founders all the time, well, if I said to you there are 100 prospects, 25 of them are in the US, 17 of them are in China, and 2 of them are in Canada, where would you think about spending your time? You're welcome. Hi.
What would you say about accessing funding for companies that are earning less than 100,000? The problem is, so many times we have an export-ready product, and you're not able to access funding because you're not yet that ready.
Yes.
So how do you?
In terms of government funding, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Funding, government.
Or government-secured funding.
The thing is, most people who have those kind of products who already have access to market, they, because of
move quickly enough. This is a huge problem. The scale, I understand completely what you're saying. The scale-up problem is also one of Canada's biggest challenges. And I talk a lot about that, actually. And I've recommended policies at all levels of government to have matching funds go quickly into organizations that are showing some traction globally, to quickly get them into a category killer position, quickly get them in front of, because that's why we lose, is when something gets momentum in the US, they lean in so hard. You look at the lean in on Uber, for example. The lean in on Uber was staggering to make sure that it was the category killer. There was the potential for a Canadian app to be Uber, but it got just overrun with capital. So I think this is a significant challenge for Canada, and I'm not suggesting that we should, that there aren't other challenges, but I think that one is a key one. I would say, my advice would be, I think the incubators and accelerators in the Canadian market now are really well suited. For example, the playbook at Ryerson DMZ, for example, there's a number of accelerators that I'm involved with as well that are really excellent at helping get seed capital to accelerate exports, and as well as domestic growth. So I would take advantage of the Canadian incubator. There's wherever your business is, there'll be one. Oh, I see. Yeah. I think that is a challenge then. I think that you have to think about locating in a major center where the incubators and accelerators are based. I think that's the only near-term solution. Hopefully the innovation ecosystem expands and that there'll be someone that built an incubator in London, but I know that's a challenge today. Although Startup Canada is also trying to tackle that. I'll take one more question. Hi. Yeah.
Going to market is the most challenging part for a startup.
Sorry? What's the most
Going
challenge?
to market.
Yes,
Go to market.
for sure.
So would you prefer
Yeah.
to educate the customer or impress the customer? Which one? You use it to go to the market. Let me give you a simple example.
Okay.
For B2B. You go there in the board, everyone in C-level, and you open your big dashboard, and everyone say, wow.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
In fact, the product
That would be an amazing experience, by the way. That doesn't happen all the time. I've been laughed out of rooms more than I've been said, wow, that's amazing.
That's amazing. Actually, in real day-to-day operation, it's not going to work. So would you prefer to educate the customer what is the pain and how do you solve it really, or just impress and keep going in the market?
I prefer the former. You need to get a practical, actual, effective solution in front of the customer. Even if it's not a wow solution, it's better to take incremental steps with the customer and build a long-term relationship than it is to have this flashy, amazing prototype that actually doesn't solve a core business problem. I'd start with small problems, especially in B2B, especially if it's B2B to enterprise. You got to be extremely narrow, extremely surgical, and solve a specific problem. You're building a relationship, and companies like Oracle were built that way. Stop. Thank you.